The smell of ham glazing in the oven should have meant warmth, family, and celebration. Instead, it meant another year of being treated like the family ghost. My name is Claire Thompson, and last Easter Sunday, when my mother Patricia announced I'd be sleeping in the basement because Victoria's college friends needed the guest rooms, I didn't argue. I just smiled and nodded, the way I'd learned to do over 26 years of being the forgotten daughter. What my family didn't know was that earlier that morning, while they were arguing about seating arrangements upstairs, I'd found something in the basement that would change everything. Hidden behind an old filing cabinet was a metal box containing documents that proved I wasn't just the unwanted child. I was the rightful owner of the one thing they treasured most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Easter morning in Millbrook, Connecticut arrived with the kind of crisp spring air that promised renewal. But in the Thompson household on Maple Street, some traditions never changed. I woke up in my childhood bedroom to the sound of my sister Victoria's laughter echoing from the kitchen, punctuated by my mother's approving hums. The guest rooms were buzzing with activity as Victoria's 3 college roommates prepared for what Mother had dubbed an elegant Easter celebration. I was 26 years old, working as a dental hygienist in nearby Waterbury, and I still felt like an intruder in my own childhood home. The house itself was a testament to my mother's need for perfection, a restored 1890s colonial with gleaming hardwood floors, antique furniture, and family portraits lining the hallway. Every portrait featured the same 3 people: Mother, Father, and Victoria. I used to wonder if I was invisible to cameras, but I'd learned the truth was much simpler. I was just invisible to them. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a soft lavender dress that I'd bought specifically for Easter, hoping it might earn me a compliment, or at least acknowledgement. The fabric was nice, not expensive, but it made me feel put together. As I made my way downstairs, the sounds of preparation grew louder. Victoria's friends were discussing their internships at prestigious firms while my mother served them fresh squeezed orange juice and homemade pastry. "Oh, Claire," my mother said when she noticed me hovering in the doorway. Her tone carried that familiar note of mild irritation, as if my presence was an unexpected complication to her perfectly planned morning. "I'm glad you're up. We need to discuss sleeping arrangements for tonight." Victoria looked up from her plate of French toast, her blonde hair perfectly curled despite having just woken up. She was 24, 2 years younger than me, but she'd always carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned her place in the world. "Mom, you said the girls could stay over after dinner, right? We're planning to drive back to campus together tomorrow." "Of course, sweetheart," Mother replied, her voice warm in a way it never was when she spoke to me. "Claire, honey, would you mind terribly sleeping in the basement tonight? The guest rooms are occupied, and I know you're used to making do." Used to making do. The phrase hit me like a familiar ache. I was used to making do with hand-me-down clothes while Victoria got shopping sprees. Used to making do with community college while Victoria attended an elite private university. Used to making do with birthday dinners at chain restaurants while Victoria got elaborate parties with hired caterers. "Of course," I heard myself say, that automatic response that had become my default over the years. "That's totally fine." My father Robert emerged from his study, already dressed in his best suit despite church being hours away. He owned Thompson & Associates Real Estate, the most successful agency in Millbrook, and he carried himself like a man who'd never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with the right connections and enough money. "Claire, good morning," he said, though his eyes were already focused on the financial section of the newspaper tucked under his arm. "I trust you'll help your mother with preparations today. Victoria's friends are very important to her future career prospects." Everything in our house revolved around Victoria's future career prospects. Her internship at a law firm in Hartford, her networking opportunities, her graduate school applications. My own career as a dental hygienist, steady and respectable as it was, never warranted the same attention or pride. The morning continued with a flurry of activity that somehow managed to exclude me while requiring my labor. I found myself washing dishes that Victoria's friends had used, setting up additional seating in the dining room, and running to the store for last-minute items that Mother had forgotten. Each errand came with a gentle reminder that I was helping the family, that this was what families did for each other. By noon, extended family began arriving for the traditional Easter feast. Uncle Mark, my mother's younger brother, was the first through the door, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the kind of genuine smile that had become rare in my family's interactions. Uncle Mark had always been different from the rest of them, warmer, more interested in people than appearance. He'd never married, dedicating himself instead to his work as a high school guidance counselor, and he had a way of noticing things that others missed. "Claire, sweetheart," he said, wrapping me in a hug that felt real and unforced. "You look beautiful. That color is perfect on you." The compliment caught me off guard, mainly because it was the first one I'd received all day. "Thank you, Uncle Mark. I'm so glad you could make it. Wouldn't miss it," he said, then lowered his voice slightly. "Though I have to say, your mother's been very focused on Victoria's friends today. I hope you know that doesn't diminish your importance to this family." I squeezed his hand gratefully, though we both knew the reality was more complicated than his kind words suggest. Uncle Mark had always tried to balance the scales in small ways, but he was just one voice in a family that had long ago decided where its priorities lay. The afternoon unfolded predictably. Victoria held court in the living room, regaling everyone with stories from her senior year, while her friends added admiring commentary. My parents beamed with pride, hanging on every word as if she were delivering a State of the Union address rather than recounting fraternity parties and spring break trips. I found myself gravitating toward the kitchen, where I could be useful without being under. The dinner preparation was elaborate. Mother's famous honey-glazed ham, roasted vegetables, 3 different potato dishes, and a dessert table that looked like something from a magazine. I peeled potatoes, arranged flowers, and tried to ignore the way conversation died whenever I entered the dining room. "Claire, dear," my mother said as I was setting out the good china, "would you mind eating in the kitchen tonight? The dining room table only seats 12 comfortably, and with Victoria's friends here, we're a bit tight on space." I paused in the act of placing a salad fork, the silverware suddenly feeling heavy in my hand. 13 people. They were rearranging 13 people around a table that could easily accommodate 14, and I was the one being asked to step aside. "Mom," Victoria said from the doorway, and for a moment I thought she might object, might insist that I belonged at the family table. Instead, she said, "Could you make sure there's extra butter in the kitchen? Sarah has some dietary restrictions." My mother nodded enthusiastically. "Of course, sweetheart." "Claire, you heard." I spent dinner listening to laughter and conversation drifting in from the dining room, while I sat alone at the kitchen counter, eating the same food but somehow tasting none of its warmth. Through the doorway, I could see Uncle Mark glancing toward the kitchen periodically, his expression troubled, but he didn't say anything. Nobody did. After dinner, as the sun began to set and the house settled into evening routines, Mother approached me with what she probably thought was a gentle smile. "Claire, honey, I've put fresh sheets on the basement couch for you. I know it's not ideal, but it's just for one night, and you've always been so understanding about these things." The basement, not the pull-out couch in the study, which would have been uncomfortable but dignified, not the air mattress in Victoria's room, which would have been crowded but familial. The basement, with its concrete floors and lingering dampness, the place where we stored Christmas decorations and outgrown furniture. "I appreciate your flexibility," my father added, not looking up from his phone. "Family requires sacrifice sometimes. Family requires sacrifice sometimes." The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been sacrificing for this family my entire life. My comfort, my needs, my sense of belonging, while they sacrificed nothing for me. "Of course," I said again, because it was easier than fighting, easier than causing a scene that would only result in me being labeled difficult or ungrateful. "Whatever works best for everyone else." As the evening wound down and Victoria's friends claimed the guest rooms with delighted squeals about thread counts and antique furniture, I made my way downstairs, with a small overnight bag, and a heart that felt heavier with each step. The basement was exactly as I remembered, cold, dim, and unwelcoming. The couch Mother had mentioned was an old sectional that smelled faintly of mildew, positioned next to the furnace and a stack of cardboard boxes labeled with years and holiday. I changed into pajamas and tried to settle in, pulling the thin blanket up to my chin and staring at the ceiling where pipes and electrical wiring created angular shadows in the dim light from the single bare bulb. Above me, I could hear footsteps and muffled conversation, as my family and their guests enjoyed the warmth and comfort of the real house. It was then, lying in that basement, that had become my Easter accommodation, that something inside me shifted. Not anger, exactly, though that was part of it. Not sadness, though I'd felt plenty of that over the years. It was something colder and more determined, a recognition that this pattern would continue forever, unless I did something to change it. I sat up on the musty couch and looked around the basement with new eyes. This wasn't just a storage space, it was where my family kept the things they wanted to forget about. Old furniture that had been replaced with better versions, holiday decorations that only saw light once a year, photo albums from when I was small before Victoria was born, and the family dynamic crystallized into its current form, and apparently, it was where they kept me, when I became inconvenient. I stood up and began walking around the space, really looking at it for the first time in years. In one corner stood an old filing cabinet that I remembered my father using in his home office, before he upgraded to a more modern system. It was pushed against the wall behind a stack of boxes, forgotten and gathering dust. Something about it called to my attention, maybe the way it sat slightly askew as if it had been moved recently, or maybe just the strange feeling that this Easter exile wasn't random, that I was meant to be down here tonight for a reason beyond my family's convenience. I moved the boxes aside and opened the top drawer of the filing cabinet. It was mostly empty, containing a few old tax returns and some expired insurance policies. The second drawer was similarly unremarkable, but the bottom drawer was locked, and when I jiggled the handle, I could hear something metallic shifting inside. I found a paperclip on the floor near my father's old desk and worked it into the lock mechanism. It took several minutes and more determination than skill, but eventually I heard a soft click. The drawer slid open to reveal a single item, a metal document box, the kind used for important papers that needed protection from fire or flood. My hands were shaking slightly as I lifted the box from the drawer. It wasn't locked, but it was heavy enough to suggest it contained substantial paperwork. I carried it back to the couch and sat down, the box balanced on my knees like a question mark. When I opened it, the first thing I saw was a manila folder labeled Pine Lake Property, Eleanor Thompson Estate, my grandmother's name. My grandmother, who had died when I was 12, whose funeral I remembered as a blur of black clothes and whispered conversations about property and inheritances and family obligations. I opened the folder with careful fingers and found myself looking at a property deed, dated 15 years ago. The document was official, notarized and absolutely clear in its language. The Pine Lake Retreat, a 4-bedroom cabin on 37 acres of waterfront property, in New Hampshire, had been bequeathed specifically and solely to Claire Elizabeth Thompson upon Eleanor Thompson's death. To me, not to the family trust, not to be divided among her heirs. To me personally and individually, with a handwritten note attached that made my breath catch in my throat. To my granddaughter Claire, the note read in my grandmother's familiar spidery handwriting, who has always carried herself with grace despite being overlooked. This property comes with my love and my hope that you will find in it the peace and belonging that sometimes eludes us in family. The lake remembers kindness, dear one, be kind to yourself. I read the note 3 times before the words fully sank in. My grandmother had left me valuable property, if the pictures in the folder were any indication, a beautiful log cabin with a stone fireplace, wraparound porch and private dock extending into a pristine mountain lake. The kind of place that appeared in real estate magazines with price tags that made people whistle in appreciation. But there was more in the box. Another folder contained correspondence between my father and a lawyer, dated just 6 months after my grandmother's funeral. Letters discussing the complications of Eleanor's will, the impracticality of a minor child owning substantial property, and the family's decision to manage the asset until Claire reached appropriate maturity. I was 26 years old. If 26 wasn't appropriate maturity, what? The final folder contained what appeared to be rental agreements and property management contracts. For the past 14 years, my family had been renting out my cabin to vacation tenants, and depositing the income into an account that, according to the bank statements, had been steadily growing, an account that I had never heard of and certainly never had access to. I sat in that basement, surrounded by the evidence of my family's deception, and felt something crack open inside me, not my heart that had been cracking for years, something harder and more fundamental. The part of me that had always assumed that if I just tried harder, loved more, caused less trouble, eventually they would see me as worth their consideration. Above me, the house had grown quiet. Victoria's friends had retired to their comfortable guest room. My parents had gone to bed in their master suite with its king-sized bed and adjoining bathroom. Everyone was settled into their rightful places in the family hierarchy. Everyone except me, apparently, because according to these documents, I wasn't at the bottom of that hierarchy after all. I was outside it entirely, owning something valuable enough that my own family had spent 14 years stealing from me, rather than acknowledging my inheritance. I closed the box carefully and sat back on the uncomfortable couch, my mind racing through implications and possibilities. Tomorrow was Monday. Banks would be open, lawyers would be available, questions could be asked and answers demanded, but tonight, I was still in the basement, still wearing the thin pajamas I'd brought for what I'd thought was a simple overnight stay with family, still breathing the damp air and listening to the furnace cycle on and off in the corner. The difference was that tonight, for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't wondering what I'd done wrong or how I could do better. Instead, I was wondering why they'd worked so hard to keep me from finding out who I really was.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
And I was smiling, because tomorrow I was going to start asking that question out loud. Monday morning arrived with the kind of gray Connecticut drizzle that matched my mood as I sat in my car outside the Millbrook Public Library, clutching a manila folder and a determination I'd never felt before. I hadn't slept much after my basement discovery, spending most of the night reading and rereading the documents I'd found, each page revealing another layer of deception that stretched back over a decade. The rain drummed against my windshield as I gathered the courage to walk inside and begin what felt like an investigation into my own life. The library's computer lab was nearly empty at 9 in the morning, just me and an elderly man researching genealogy at a terminal near the window. I chose a computer in the back corner and logged into my email, then began the painstaking process of searching through years of family communications for any mention of Pine Lake, property management, or rental income. What I found was a masterclass in selective information sharing. My father's emails to family members over the years painted a picture of careful financial stewardship. Messages to my Aunt Linda about managing Eleanor's estate responsibly, and updates to Uncle Mark about ensuring the property remains profitable for future generations. Never once was I mentioned as the actual owner. In every email, the property was referred to as the family cabin or Eleanor's place, as if my grandmother had left it to some collective entity rather than specifically to me. The most revealing discovery came in a thread from 3 years ago, when Victoria had apparently asked about using the cabin for a graduation party. My father's response was swift and clear. The Pine Lake property generates significant rental income that helps fund your education and future opportunities. We can't afford to lose peak summer revenue for a party. He went on to explain that the property was being held in trust until family circumstances stabilize, whatever that meant. I printed out every relevant email and added them to my growing folder of evidence. The pattern was becoming clear. My family had turned my inheritance into their private investment fund, using the income to support Victoria's expensive education while telling me nothing about the property's existence. But there was something else emerging from the email threads, something that made my stomach tighten with a different kind of recognition. I started searching for references to other family events, other times when I'd been excluded or diminished, and found a correspondence trail that painted my childhood and adolescence in a new and disturbing light. Email discussions about birthday parties, where my parents debated whether to invite my friends, because Claire's social circle isn't quite the image we want to project. Messages about family vacations where my mother suggested that perhaps Claire would be happier staying with Mark so that Victoria could bring a friend instead. One email from my mother to my father, dated during my junior year of high school, was particularly brutal in its casual cruelty. Claire's been asking about college again. I think we should gently redirect her toward community college and perhaps a trade. Victoria will need our full financial support for her university years. And frankly, Claire doesn't have the social skills for a competitive academic environment. We should focus our resources where they'll have the most impact. I read that message 3 times, feeling each word land like a physical blow. They hadn't encouraged me toward community college because they thought it was the best fit for my ability. They'd steered me there because they'd already decided I wasn't worth investing in, that I was the expendable child whose dreams could be sacrificed for Victoria's ambitions. The librarian walked by and asked quietly if I was all right. I realized I'd been sitting motionless for several minutes, staring at the screen with tears threatening to spill over. Just doing some research, I managed, and she nodded sympathetically before continuing her round. I began searching for property records and rental listings for Pine Lake Retreat, and what I found made my hands shake with anger. The cabin was listed on multiple vacation rental websites as luxury lakefront getaway, perfect for family reunions and corporate retreat. The nightly rate was $400, and according to the booking calendar, it was reserved solid from May through October every year. Even accounting for maintenance and management fees, the annual income had to be substantial. I calculated quickly in my head. 14 years of rental income at an average of $300 per night for roughly 50 nights per year. My family had generated over $600,000 from my property. $600,000 that rightfully belonged to me, that could have paid for my education, helped me buy a house, given me the financial security that would have allowed me to stand up to them years ago. But the financial theft was only part of the betrayal. The deeper wound was the realization that my family's treatment of me wasn't random or thoughtless. It was systematic and deliberate. They'd decided early on that I was the child who didn't matter, and they'd structured their entire family dynamic around that decision. I thought about all the times I'd been told there wasn't money for things I wanted or needed. Dance lessons that were too expensive while Victoria got private piano and writing instruction. School trips I couldn't attend because of budget constraints while Victoria went on class trips to Europe. The used car I'd bought myself at 19 while Victoria got a new Honda for her 16th birthday, paid for with money that was technically mine. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Hope you slept well in the basement, honey. Victoria's friends said they had such a lovely time. When you have a chance, could you return the extra blankets to the linen closet? Thanks." The casual tone of the message, the assumption that I would continue to handle the household maintenance after being exiled to the basement, suddenly felt like another layer of disrespect. I was expected to be grateful for the privilege of sleeping on a musty couch and then clean up after the guests who'd displaced me. Instead of responding to her text, I called Uncle Mark. "Claire, sweetheart," he answered on the second ring. "How are you feeling after yesterday?" I have to say, I wasn't comfortable with the sleeping arrangements. His acknowledgement of the situation gave me courage. "Uncle Mark, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. What do you know about Grandma Eleanor's will?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Why are you asking about that, honey?" "Because I found documents in the basement last night that suggest she left me property that my parents have been managing without telling me about it." Another pause, longer this time. Then Uncle Mark sighed deeply. "Oh, Claire, I was hoping this day wouldn't come, but maybe it's time. Can you meet me for coffee?" This isn't a conversation for the phone. We met at Pine Grove Cafe, a local diner that had been serving strong coffee and honest food to Millbrook residents for 30 years. Uncle Mark was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with 2 cups steaming on the table, and an expression that mixed relief with regret. "I've been carrying this secret for too long," he said without preamble as I slid into the seat across from him. "Your grandmother specifically asked me to look out for you after she died, to make sure you knew about your inheritance when you turned 18. But your parents convinced me to wait, said you weren't mature enough to handle property ownership." "I'm 26, Uncle Mark." "I know," he said quietly. I know, and I've felt guilty about it every year that passed. Your mother kept saying they were protecting you, that they were managing the property responsibly until you were ready. I wanted to believe them because the alternative was believing that my own sister was stealing from her daughter. He explained that the Pine Lake property had been Eleanor's pride and joy, a cabin she'd bought in the 1970s as a young widow with money from my grandfather's life insurance. She'd spent summers there with her children, hosting family reunions and creating the kind of memories that my father often spoke about with misty-eyed nostalgia. Your grandmother always had a special bond with you, Uncle Mark continued. She used to say that you had her same quiet strength, that you could see people's true nature even when you were just a little girl. She was worried about how your parents favored Victoria, worried that you'd grow up thinking you weren't good enough. So she left me the cabin to prove I was worth something. She left you the cabin because she knew you'd appreciate it the way she did. She also left you something else that your parents never told you about. Uncle Mark reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope, yellowed with age. She asked me to give this to you when you found out about the property. Inside the envelope was a letter in my grandmother's handwriting, dated a month before her death. My dearest Claire, if you're reading this, it means you've discovered the truth about your inheritance. I hope you'll forgive an old woman for not being brave enough to tell you directly, but I knew your parents would fight me if they knew what I was planning. The cabin at Pine Lake is yours, completely and legally. But more than that, I want you to know that I see who you are, kind, observant, resilient, and worthy of love and respect. Your parents love you in their way, but they've never understood that their way of loving has left you feeling invisible. You are not invisible, my dear granddaughter. You are the best of our family, and I hope this gift will give you the independence to build a life where you're valued for exactly who you are. The lake has been my sanctuary for 40 years. I hope it will be yours too. Under the loose floorboard in the cabin's kitchen, beside the refrigerator, you'll find a metal box with keys and bank account information. I've been saving money specifically for you since the day you were born. Use it wisely, but don't be afraid to use it. All my love, Grandma Eleanor. I read the letter twice while Uncle Mark watched my face, his own expression heavy with years of suppressed guilt. There's more money, I don't know how much, but knowing your grandmother, it's substantial. She was always careful with money, and she had strong opinions about family fairness. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Any of this? Uncle Mark rubbed his face with both hands. Because I wanted to believe that your parents would do the right thing, eventually, because I didn't want to tear the family apart, because I was a coward. He looked up at me with eyes that looked older than they had when we'd sat down. I'm sorry, Claire. I failed you, and I failed your grandmother. I reached across the table and took his hand. You're telling me now, that's what matters. We sat in silence for a few minutes, the weight of decades of family dysfunction settling between us like a third presence at the table. Finally, Uncle Mark spoke again. What are you going to do? I thought about the question carefully. What was I going to do? 24 hours ago, I would have said nothing. I would have found a way to rationalize or minimize what I'd discovered, would have convinced myself that my parents had good reasons for their choices, that confronting them would only cause unnecessary drama. But something had shifted during my night in the basement, something that had crystallized further during my morning of research and Uncle Mark's confessions. I was tired of being the family member who absorbed disappointment and disrespect in silence. I was tired of making myself smaller so that others could feel bigger. I'm going to drive up to New Hampshire, I said. I want to see my property. Uncle Mark nodded slowly. Do you want company? I considered the offer. Part of me wanted the support, the validation of having someone on my side, but another part of me needed to do this alone, needed to walk into my inheritance with no one else's emotions or expectations coloring the experience. I think I need to go by myself, I said, but thank you for offering, and thank you for finally telling me the truth. Claire, Uncle Mark said as I started to gather my things, whatever you decide to do about your parents, know that I support you. You've been patient and forgiving for long enough. I drove home to my apartment in Waterbury, with Uncle Mark's words echoing in my mind. Patient and forgiving for long enough. How long was long enough? How many years of being dismissed and overlooked, and outright robbed did someone owe to family members who saw them as expendable? My apartment felt different when I walked in, smaller somehow, but also temporary in a way it never had before. I'd rented this place because it was what I could afford on a dental hygienist's salary, not because it was where I wanted to build a life. I'd furnished it with hand-me-downs and careful purchases, creating comfort within strict financial constraints. But if my grandmother had left me money in addition to the property, if I was actually entitled to 14 years of rental income, then my financial constraints weren't real. They were artificial limitations imposed by people who'd stolen my resources, while convincing me I should be grateful for their scraps. I called in sick to work, which I'd never done for anything short of genuine illness, and spent the rest of the day planning my trip to New Hampshire. The drive would take about 3 hours, and I wanted to arrive during daylight so I could see the property clearly. I packed an overnight bag, printed out directions to the cabin, and called the property management company that handled the rentals. Pine Lake Retreat, a cheerful voice answered. "This is Sandra. How can I help you?" "Hi Sandra, I'm calling about the cabin rental. I'm actually the property owner, and I'd like to visit this week." "Oh," Sandra sounded surprised. "I usually coordinate with Mr. Thompson about owner visits. Will he be joining you?" "No, I'll be coming alone, and actually I'd like to discuss the management arrangement when I'm there. Can you make sure the property is available tomorrow afternoon?" "Of course, but I should mention that we have bookings starting Friday for the weekend. Will that be enough time for your visit?" I assured her it would be and hung up, realizing that I'd just made my first decision about the property without consulting my parents. It felt both terrifying and exhilarating, like jumping off a cliff without knowing how deep the water was below. That evening, I sat in my living room, with my laptop open to real estate websites, researching property values in the Pine Lake area. Based on comparable sales and the rental income potential, my cabin was worth somewhere between $800,000. Even at the conservative estimate, it represented more wealth than I'd ever imagined owning, but the money, significant as it was, felt less important than what it represented. This wasn't just about financial security, it was about identity and self-worth, and the right to exist on equal terms with the rest of my family. For 26 years, I'd accepted their assessment of my value. Now I had proof that their assessment was not only wrong but deliberately and criminally distorted. I made a list of questions I wanted to ask Sandra when I met with her. How long had she been managing the property? What kind of income had it generated? Were there any issues with maintenance or tenant complaints? Had my father given her any specific instructions about communication or decision-making? Then I made another list. This one of things I wanted to say to my parents when I returned from New Hampshire. This list was harder to write, filled with emotions I'd spent years suppressing and accusations I'd never dared to voice. But as I wrote, I felt something loosening in my chest, a knot of resentment and self-doubt that had been so much a part of me that I'd forgotten it wasn't natural. I went to bed that night with my overnight bag packed and my grandmother's letter on the nightstand beside me. Tomorrow, I would drive to New Hampshire and see the property that had been mine for 14 years without my knowledge. I would find the money my grandmother had hidden for me and begin to understand the full scope of what my family had taken. But more than that, I would begin to understand who I was when I wasn't constantly trying to earn love from people who'd already decided I wasn't worth it. I would begin to discover what Claire Thompson looked like when she wasn't living in someone else's shadow, accepting someone else's assessment of her worth. The rain had stopped by the time I fell asleep, and for the first time in months, I didn't dream about trying to find my place at tables where no seat had been saved for me. Instead, I dreamed about lakes and cabins and rooms full of sunlight where I belonged simply because I was there. The drive to New Hampshire was nothing like I'd expected. I'd imagined feeling nervous or uncertain, but instead, I felt a strange sense of homecoming as I wound through mountains and forests I'd never seen before. The GPS led me off the main highway onto progressively smaller roads until I was driving on a dirt lane that curved through towering pines and emerged into a clearing where a log cabin sat, like something from a dream. Pine Lake Retreat was more beautiful than the rental photos had suggested. The logs were a warm honey color that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight, and the wraparound porch was furnished with wooden rocking chairs and hanging baskets of flowers that someone had been carefully maintaining. The lake stretched out beyond the cabin, mirror smooth and surrounded by mountains that reflected perfectly in its surface. I sat in my car for several minutes, just staring at this place that was mine, trying to reconcile the modest dental hygienist who'd driven here with the woman who apparently owned a piece of paradise. A pickup truck pulled up beside me, and a woman in her 50s climbed out, wearing jeans and a fleece jacket with Pine Lake Property Management embroidered on the chest. "You must be Claire," she said, walking over with a warm smile and an extended hand. "I'm Sandra Wall. I've been managing your family's property for about 8 years now." "My family's property." I shook her hand, and managed to smile back, though something about her phrasing made me want to correct her immediately. "Thank you for meeting me here. I hope this wasn't too much trouble." "Not at all," Sandra said, pulling a ring of keys from her pocket. "Though I have to say, I'm curious about your visit. Your father usually handles all the owner communication, and he never mentioned that you might be coming up." We walked toward the cabin together, and I found myself studying every detail: the stone foundation, the carved wooden bears flanking the front steps, the wind chimes that sang softly in the breeze. Everything about the place felt peaceful and welcoming, the kind of sanctuary my grandmother had described in her letter. "Actually," I said, as Sandra unlocked the front door, "I wanted to talk to you about the management arrangement. I'm hoping to get more involved in the property decisions going forward." Sandra paused with her hand on the doorknob. "Of course, though I should mention that your father has been very specific about maintaining consistency in our approach. He's always said that too many decision-makers can complicate property management." The front door opened onto a living room that took my breath away. Massive windows looked out over the lake, and a stone fireplace dominated one wall, with built-in bookshelves on either side filled with what appeared to be a mix of classic literature and local history. The furniture was rustic but comfortable, all natural wood and earth tones that complemented the cabin's architecture. "It's beautiful," I said, and meant it. This wasn't just a rental property, it was a home, carefully decorated and lovingly maintained. "Your grandmother had wonderful taste," Sandra said, watching me take in the space. "The renters always comment on how welcoming it feels, not like staying in a hotel, more like visiting family." We walked through the cabin together, and Sandra pointed out various features and improvements that had been made over the years: new appliances in the kitchen, updated bathrooms, a deck that had been expanded to better take advantage of the lake view. Everything had been done thoughtfully, and with obvious care for preserving the cabin's character. "The property generates excellent income," Sandra explained as we stood on the deck looking out over the water. "We typically book from May through October, and we get a lot of repeat guests. Families who come back year after year, corporate groups who use it for retreats. Your father's been very pleased with the returns." I nodded, though something about her continued references to my father was starting to grate on me. "Sandra, can I ask you something? In all the years you've been managing this property, have you ever dealt with anyone other than my father?" She looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" "I mean, has anyone else from the family ever contacted you? Made decisions about bookings or maintenance or pricing?" "Well, no," she said slowly. "Your father has always been very clear that he's the sole contact for property matters. He said it was important to avoid confusion or conflicting instructions." I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the same feeling I'd had when reading my parents' emails the day before. Even here, even with property that was legally and rightfully mine, my father had established himself as the sole authority, cutting me out of decisions about my own inheritance. "Sandra, I need to see the financial records for the property, all of them, going back to when you started managing it." Her expression shifted slightly, becoming more cautious. "I can certainly provide those, though I usually send all financial reports directly to your father. Is there a specific concern you have? I just want to understand the full picture of how my property has been performing." I emphasized the word "my," just slightly, testing to see if she'd pick up on the implication. "Of course," she said, though she looked uncertain. "I have most of the records in my office, which is about 20 minutes from here. Would you like to follow me there?" Before we left the cabin, I asked if I could have a few minutes alone inside. Sandra agreed, and went to wait in her truck while I walked back through the rooms, trying to absorb the reality that this place belonged to me. In the kitchen, I remembered my grandmother's letter, and began examining the floor beside the refrigerator. The floorboards were wide pine planks, obviously original to the cabin, and it took me several minutes to identify the one that seemed slightly different from the other. When I pressed on it, it shifted just enough to reveal that it wasn't nailed down like the rest. I worked my fingers around the edges and managed to lift it, revealing a shallow space underneath. Inside was a metal box, similar to the one I'd found in my parents' basement, but smaller and more weathered. My hands shook as I lifted it out and opened it on the kitchen counter. Inside were 3 items: a set of keys, a bank statement, and another letter from my grandmother. The bank statement was from a credit union in New Hampshire, dated just 3 months before my grandmother's death. The account balance was $347,000 that had been sitting in an account I'd never known existed, earning interest for 14 years while I struggled to pay for community college and saved for months to afford a reliable used car. The letter was shorter than the first one, but no less significant. Claire, this money represents 40 years of saving for your future. It includes the money your grandfather left for his grandchildren, money I've saved from my own income, and the profits from some wise investments over the years. It's yours to use as you see fit, but I hope you'll remember that real wealth isn't just about money. It's about freedom to make choices based on your own values, rather than other people's expectations. The account number and routing information are on the back of this letter. All you need to do is present identification and your grandmother's death certificate to access the funds. Love, Grandma Eleanor. I read the letter 3 times before putting it back in the box, along with the bank statement and key. The keys, I assumed, were for the cabin, and possibly for other items here that my grandmother had wanted me to have. As I replaced the floorboard, I felt a strange combination of vindication and fury. Vindication, because I now had concrete proof of my grandmother's intentions and the extent of my inheritance. Fury, because my parents had not only stolen from me, but had forced me to live a life of unnecessary financial constraint while sitting on resources that could have changed everything. The drive to Sandra's office gave me time to process what I'd discovered and plan my approach to the conversation ahead. I needed information, but I also needed to be careful not to reveal too much about my family situation until I understood exactly what Sandra knew and what role, if any, she'd played in the deception. Sandra's office was in a small building that housed several local businesses, including a real estate agency and an accounting firm. Her space was efficiently organized, with filing cabinets and a computer setup that suggested someone who took property management seriously. She pulled out a thick folder and spread the financial records across her desk. These go back to when I started managing the property in 2016, she explained. Before that, your father was handling rentals himself, though I understand the income wasn't as consistent. I studied the documents carefully, noting that the property had indeed been profitable under Sandra's management. Monthly statements showed rental income, expenses for maintenance and cleaning, and net profits that were consistently deposited into an account at a bank in Millbrook. My father's account, I assumed, though Sandra's records didn't specify the account holder. Can I ask who receives these monthly profit distributions? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Your father, of course. The checks are made out to Robert Thompson and mailed to his office in Millbrook. I nodded as if this was expected, but inside I was calculating the numbers. Over 8 years of Sandra's management, the property had generated nearly $300,000 in profit after expenses. Combined with whatever income it had produced during the 6 years before Sandra took over, my family had likely collected close to $500,000 from my inheritance. Sandra, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. Did my father ever mention that this property actually belongs to me, not to him? She looked genuinely surprised by the question. What do you mean? I pulled out the property deed from my purse and placed it on her desk. According to this legal document, my grandmother left Pine Lake Retreat specifically to me when she died 14 years ago. My father has been collecting rental income from my property without my knowledge or consent. Sandra stared at the deed for a long moment, then looked up at me with an expression that had shifted from confusion to concern. Claire, I had no idea. Your father has always presented himself as the owner. All of our contracts and agreements are in his name. I understand that you were acting in good faith, I assured her, but now that you know the truth, I need to discuss how we're going to handle things going forward. We spent the next hour going through every aspect of the property management arrangement. Sandra showed me rental agreements, maintenance records, and correspondence with tenants. She also explained that my father had been very particular about certain aspects of the management, including his insistence that all communication go through him, and his specific instructions about what information should and shouldn't be shared with potential renters. He was always concerned about privacy, Sandra explained. He said the family valued discretion and didn't want their personal business discussed with strangers. I began to understand that my father's concern about privacy was likely more about controlling information than protecting the family. By positioning himself as the sole point of contact, he'd ensured that no one would accidentally reveal details that might lead me to discover my inheritance. Sandra, I want to make some changes to the management arrangement, I said. First, I want all future communications to come to me directly. Second, I want you to set up a new bank account for property income, with me as the sole signatory. And third, I want you to send me copies of all historical records, including anything you might have about the period before you started managing the property. Sandra nodded, though she looked uncomfortable. I can certainly do all of that, but I should mention that I have a contract with your father that runs through the end of this year. I don't want to create any legal complications. Your contract is with someone who was misrepresenting his authority over the property, I pointed out. I think that changes things significantly, but I don't want to put you in a difficult position. Why don't you contact your attorney and ask about the legal implications? In the meantime, I'd appreciate it if you didn't mention our conversation to my father. Of course, Sandra said, though she still looked troubled. Claire, can I ask what you're planning to do about this situation? I mean, with your family. It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since leaving Millbrook that morning. What was I planning to do? I had legal ownership of valuable property, documentation of years of theft, and evidence of systematic deception that went far beyond simple family favoritism. I'm still figuring that out, I admitted, but I know that I'm not going to continue pretending this never happened. I drove back to the cabin as the sun was beginning to set, painting the lake in shades of gold and orange that made the whole landscape look like something from a painting. I'd arranged to stay overnight, partly because I wanted to experience the property as more than just a visitor, but mostly because I needed time to think without the distractions of my normal life. The cabin felt different in the evening light, more intimate and peaceful. I built a fire in the stone fireplace, and sat in one of the leather chairs my grandmother had chosen, looking out at the lake and trying to process everything I'd learned. The financial impact was significant. Between the property value, the accumulated rental income, and the money in the New Hampshire bank account, I was potentially worth over $1 million, but the emotional impact was even more profound. I thought about all the times I'd felt inadequate or unsuccessful compared to Victoria, all the times I'd wondered if I was somehow fundamentally flawed or less deserving of love and support. My parents had allowed me to believe those things about myself while actively working to ensure they remained true. They'd limited my opportunities and resources, then pointed to my limitations as evidence that their favoritism was justified. But there was something else I was beginning to understand, something that went beyond the financial theft or even the emotional manipulation. My parents had robbed me of more than money. They'd robbed me of the chance to know my grandmother's true feelings about me. For 14 years I'd believed that she'd seen me the same way my parents did, as the less important grandchild who merited less consideration and investment. Instead, she'd seen me clearly enough to leave me her most treasured possession, and had saved money specifically for my future, because she wanted me to have choices and independence. She'd loved me enough to try to protect me from exactly the kind of treatment my parents had subjected me to. I called Uncle Mark from the cabin that evening and told him about my discoveries. His silence after I finished speaking was long and heavy. $600,000, he finally said. Claire, they've stolen $600,000 from you, and that's just the rental income. The property itself is worth close to $1 million. What are you going to do? It was the same question Sandra had asked, and I was beginning to formulate an answer. I'm going to gather all the evidence I can find, document everything, and then I'm going to confront them with the truth. And if they deny it or try to rationalize it. I looked out at the lake, dark now except for the reflection of stars on its surface. My grandmother had written that the lake remembers kindness, and I wondered what other memories it held. Probably decades of family gatherings where my father had brought his children to swim and fish and build memories in this place that was never really his to share. Then I'm going to show them exactly how much power the forgotten daughter actually has. After I hung up with Uncle Mark, I spent several hours going through the cabin systematically, looking for anything else my grandmother might have left for me. In a bedroom closet, I found a box of photo albums spanning decades of family history. Many of the pictures showed my father as a child and teenager, playing at the lake with his siblings and friends. My grandmother had documented every summer, every holiday, every milestone that had taken place at Pine Lake. But there were also newer photos, pictures I'd never seen before. Photos of me as a baby and toddler, visiting the cabin with my parents before Victoria was born. In these pictures, I looked happy and loved, held by parents who seemed genuinely delighted with their daughter. My father was teaching me to fish from the dock. My mother was reading to me on the porch swing. I studied these images for a long time, trying to understand when and why things had changed. When had I become the expendable child, the one whose needs could be sacrificed for family harmony and financial convenience? The photos suggested that there had been a time when my parents had loved me the same way they now loved Victoria, but something had shifted that love into something conditional and ultimately withdrawn. Maybe it was Victoria's birth and her immediate claim on my parents' attention and resources. Maybe it was my father's growing business success and his increasing focus on social status and family image. Maybe it was simply that I was quieter and less demanding than Victoria, making it easier to overlook my needs in favor of her. Whatever the reason, looking at these photos made me realize that my current situation wasn't inevitable or natural. There had been a time when I was valued and cherished, which meant the problem wasn't with me. It was with my family's choices about how to treat me. I packed the photo albums along with the financial documents I'd gathered from Sandra. Tomorrow, I would drive back to Connecticut with more than just evidence of theft. I would return with proof that I'd once been loved the way every child deserves to be loved, and that my family's current treatment of me represented a betrayal not just of my grandmother's wishes, but of their own earlier self. But tonight, I would sleep in the cabin my grandmother had left me, surrounded by the peace and beauty she'd wanted me to have. I would dream in a place where I belonged completely and unconditionally, where my worth wasn't measured against someone else's achievements, or dependent on someone else's approval. As I settled into the comfortable bed in the cabin's master bedroom, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The deep satisfaction of being exactly where I was supposed to be. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations and painful confrontations, but tonight I was home in a way I'd never been before, surrounded by tangible evidence of love that had never wavered, even in death. The drive back to Connecticut felt different than any journey I'd ever taken. I wasn't returning as the same person who'd left 2 days earlier. In my passenger seat sat boxes of documents, photo albums and evidence that would irrevocably change my family's dynamic. The woman driving this car owned property worth over $1 million and had access to hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen income and hidden savings. More importantly, she had shed the doubt and self-recrimination that had defined her for 26 years. I'd made several decisions during my night at the cabin. First, I was going to transfer the property management away from Sandra and my father immediately, establishing myself as the sole decision-maker for Pine Lake Retreat. Second, I was going to demand a full accounting of every dollar that had been taken from the rental income over the past 14 years. Third, I was going to access the bank account my grandmother had left me, and use those funds to hire an attorney who could help me navigate the legal implications of what my family had done. But most importantly, I was going to confront my parents directly, presenting them with evidence and demanding explanations before deciding how far to take the legal action. Part of me hoped they would provide some reasonable justification for their behavior, some explanation that would make sense of 14 years of deception. A larger part of me knew that no such explanation existed, and that I was about to discover just how far they were willing to go to protect their version of family reality. I drove straight to my apartment in Waterbury, where I spread all my evidence across my dining room table and began organizing it chronologically. Bank statements, rental agreements, email communications, property deeds, and my grandmother's letters created a timeline that told a clear story of systematic theft and deliberate exclusion. I photographed every document, created digital copies, and stored them in multiple locations to ensure my parents couldn't somehow make the evidence disappear. Then I called David Park, an attorney, whose name Uncle Mark had given me years earlier when I'd had a minor legal issue with my apartment lease. David specialized in estate law and family disputes, which made him perfect for my current situation. "Claire Thompson," he said when his secretary put me through. "Mark's niece, right? How can I help you?" I explained the situation as clearly and concisely as possible, focusing on the legal facts rather than the emotional complexity. David listened without interruption, asking occasional clarifying questions about dates and amounts. "This is a significant case," he said when I finished. "We're looking at potential criminal charges for fraud and theft, plus civil recovery of damages that could include not just the stolen income but punitive damages and interest. Before we proceed, I need to ask, what outcome are you hoping for?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been wrestling with since leaving New Hampshire. I want them to acknowledge what they've done and return every dollar they've taken. Beyond that, I'm not sure. I don't want to destroy my family, but I also can't continue to be the person they've decided I am. "Understood. Let me review the documents you've gathered, and we'll schedule a meeting to discuss strategy. In the meantime, I'd recommend that you don't confront your parents until we've had a chance to talk. They might try to destroy evidence or transfer assets if they realize you've discovered their deception." I agreed to wait, though every instinct I had was pushing me to drive to Millbrook immediately and demand answers. Instead, I spent the rest of the week quietly gathering additional evidence and preparing for what would likely be the most difficult conversation of my life. I visited the New Hampshire Credit Union where my grandmother's account was held, presenting the death certificate I'd obtained from the town clerk and my identification. The account had grown to over $380,000 through compound interest, and the bank officer who helped me transfer the funds was impressed by my grandmother's financial planning. She was very specific about the account structure, the officer explained. Everything was set up to minimize taxes and maximize growth, with clear instructions that only you could access the funds after presenting proper documentation. She obviously cared a great deal about your financial security. With my grandmother's money now accessible, I felt a freedom I'd never experienced before. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't have to worry about rent or car payments or whether I could afford to replace something that broke. More than that, I had the resources to hire excellent legal representation and pursue justice without fear of financial ruin. I also used some of the money to hire a forensic accountant recommended by David Park. Jennifer Martinez specialized in uncovering hidden assets and financial deception in family disputes, and she agreed to conduct a comprehensive audit of my parents' finances to determine exactly how much of my inheritance they'd used and where it had gone. "Family financial fraud is unfortunately common," Jennifer explained during our initial meeting. "Parents often justify taking from one child's inheritance by claiming they're managing it for the family's benefit or protecting it until the child is ready. But the law is clear about fiduciary responsibilities, and what your parents have done appears to be a serious breach of trust." While Jennifer began her investigation, and David prepared the legal framework for confronting my parents, I made another important decision. I called my employer and gave notice, explaining that I'd come into an inheritance that would allow me to pursue other opportunities. My supervisor was surprised but supportive, and I arranged to work for 2 more weeks while training my replacement. Leaving my job felt like shedding an old skin. I'd enjoyed my work as a dental hygienist, and I'd been good at it, but it had also represented the limited options I'd believed were available to me. Now, with financial independence and the knowledge that my constraints had been artificially imposed, I could imagine possibilities I'd never dared to consider before. The call came from Uncle Mark on a Thursday evening, just as I was preparing dinner in my apartment. "Claire, honey, I think your parents know something's up. Your mother called me today asking if I'd spoken to you recently." She seemed worried. What did you tell her? I told her we'd had coffee earlier this week but didn't go into detail. But she kept pressing, asking if you'd seemed upset about anything, or mentioned any family concerns. It felt like she was fishing for information. I wasn't entirely surprised. It had been almost a week since Easter, and my parents were probably wondering why I hadn't thanked them for the family dinner or asked about using their basement again in the future. My absence from their usual pattern of minimal communication was probably noticeable. I think it's time, I said. David wants to meet tomorrow to finalize our approach, and then I'm going to request a family meeting. Do you want me to be there for support? I considered the offer, but I knew this was something I needed to do alone. My parents had spent years diminishing me in front of family members, making me seem like the dramatic or unreasonable one whenever I expressed dissatisfaction with my treatment. This conversation needed to happen without any witnesses they could later blame for influencing me or encouraging conflict. Thank you, but I think it should just be the four of us, my parents, Victoria and me. They need to understand that this is coming from me alone, not because someone else is stirring up trouble. Friday's meeting with David went exactly as I'd hoped. He'd reviewed all my documentation and consulted with Jennifer about her preliminary findings. The legal case against my parents was strong enough to virtually guarantee success if we proceeded to court, but David recommended starting with a formal demand letter that laid out the facts and gave them an opportunity to respond before we filed any lawsuit. Sometimes families can resolve these issues privately when confronted with overwhelming evidence, David explained. It's cheaper, faster, and less publicly damaging than going through the court system. But we need to be prepared for the possibility that they'll deny everything or try to claim they were acting in your best interests. Jennifer's initial findings had been particularly damaging to my parents' potential defense. She'd traced the rental income from Pine Lake through my father's business accounts and discovered that the money had been used for a variety of family expenses, including Victoria's private school tuition, family vacations, and improvements to my parents' home. None of it had been saved or invested for my benefit. They've treated your inheritance like their personal checking account, Jennifer explained. There's no evidence that they ever intended to return the money or that they were managing it for your benefit. This looks like straightforward conversion of assets. Armed with legal advice and comprehensive evidence, I called my mother on Saturday morning and requested a family meeting for Sunday afternoon. I kept my tone neutral and businesslike, explaining that I had some important family matters to discuss and would appreciate everyone being present. Of course, dear, my mother said, though I could hear the curiosity and slight concern in her voice. Is everything all right? You've been rather quiet since Easter. Everything's fine, Mom. I just have some things I need to discuss with everyone. Would 2 o'clock work? We agreed on the time, and I spent Saturday evening preparing for what would likely be the most important conversation of my life. I organized my evidence in a folder, practiced explaining the key points calmly and clearly, and tried to anticipate their possible responses. Sunday afternoon arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood as I drove to my childhood home in Millbrook. The house looked the same as always, perfectly maintained, expensively decorated, and somehow unwelcoming despite its obvious beauty. I sat in my car for several minutes, gathering courage and reminding myself that I belonged here as much as anyone else, that I had every right to demand answers and accountability. My parents were waiting in the living room when I arrived, along with Victoria, who looked puzzled about why she'd been summoned for a family meeting. My mother had set out coffee and cookies, as if this were a social visit rather than a reckoning. "Claire, sweetheart," my father said, standing to give me a brief hug. "Your mother said you wanted to discuss some family matters. I hope there's nothing wrong." "Actually, there is something wrong," I said, remaining standing rather than settling into the comfortable seating arrangement they'd obviously prepared. "Something very wrong that we need to address." I pulled out the folder I'd prepared and placed it on the coffee table. 2 weeks ago, when you made me sleep in the basement on Easter night, I found some documents hidden in your old filing cabinet. Documents that revealed something I should have known 14 years ago. My mother's face went very still. My father's expression didn't change, but I saw his hands tighten slightly on his coffee cup. Victoria looked confused, glancing between her parents and me as if trying to understand what was happening. "I found the deed to Pine Lake Retreat," I continued, pulling out the document and placing it where everyone could see it. The property deed that shows Grandma Eleanor left the cabin specifically to me when she died. Not to the family, not to be shared, to me personally and individually. The silence that followed was profound. Victoria leaned forward to read the deed, her expression shifting from confusion to shock as she absorbed its content. My parents said nothing, but I could see the calculation in their eyes as they tried to determine how much I knew and what I intended to do about it. I also found Grandma's letters, I said, placing them on the table as well. Letters explaining that she left me the cabin because she was worried about how I was being treated by this family. Letters telling me about money she'd saved specifically for me. Claire, my father began, his voice taking on the reasonable paternal tone he used when he wanted to end uncomfortable conversations. I understand you're upset about finding those documents, but you have to understand the complexity of the situation. When your grandmother died, you were only 12 years old. We made the decision to manage the property on your behalf until you were mature enough to handle that responsibility. I'm 26 years old, Dad. When exactly was I going to be considered mature enough? We were waiting for you to demonstrate more stability in your life, my mother interjected, her own voice taking on the slightly sharp edge it acquired when she felt challenged. Your job, your living situation, your general life choices haven't exactly suggested that you were ready for property ownership. The familiar sting of their criticism hit me, but this time it bounced off rather than sinking. I knew now that my instability had been largely created by their deliberate limitation of my resources and opportunities. So you've been managing the property for my benefit? I asked. That's your explanation? Of course, my father said. The rental income has been carefully saved and invested. We've always intended to turn everything over to you when the time was right. I pulled out the bank statements Jennifer had obtained, showing the flow of rental income through my father's business accounts and into family expenses. These financial records tell a different story. The rental income from my property has been used to pay for Victoria's education, family vacations, and home improvement. None of it has been saved for me. Victoria had gone very pale as she looked at the documents spread across the coffee table. Mom, Dad, is this true? Have you been using Claire's inheritance for our family expenses? Victoria, sweetheart, my mother said quickly. This is much more complicated than your sister is making it seem. Property management involves many decisions and expenses that someone without business experience wouldn't understand. What I understand, I said, pulling out the rental income statements Sandra had provided, is that over the past 14 years, my property has generated approximately $600,000 in income. Income that legally belongs to me but has been deposited into Dad's business account. The number hit the room like a physical blow. Victoria made a small sound of shock, and my father's reasonable expression finally cracked. Claire, you're being dramatic, he said, but his voice had lost its confident tone. The money wasn't stolen. It was managed responsibly by people who understand finance and property investment. People who understand finance well enough to forge my signature on legal documents. I pulled out the property transfer papers I'd found in the basement, along with examples of my real signature for comparison. This isn't my signature, Dad. Someone committed fraud to create these documents. My mother stood abruptly, her coffee cup clattering against its saucer. Claire, Elizabeth Thompson, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but this family has always acted in your best interest. Everything we've done has been to protect you and provide for this family's security, including lying to me for 14 years about owning property worth over $1 million. I stood as well, meeting her angry gaze with calm determination, including using my inheritance to pay for Victoria's private education, while telling me we couldn't afford for me to attend a 4-year university. You weren't suited for university, my father said, and there it was, the brutal honesty that had always lurked beneath their reasonable explanations. Your grades, your social skills, your overall presentation, we made realistic decisions about where to invest our resources. Your resources, I felt something cold and sharp crystallizing in my chest. You just admitted that you deliberately limited my opportunities so you could spend my money on Victoria's future. Victoria had been silent throughout this exchange, but now she spoke up, her voice small and shaky. Mom, Dad, You paid for my education with Claire's money. We paid for your education with family money, my mother said firmly. Money that was being managed responsibly for the benefit of everyone. No, I said, placing the bank account information from New Hampshire on the table. Grandma left me additional money that you didn't even know about, $380,000 that she specifically saved for my future, with instructions that I was to use it for my own choices and independence. The impact of this revelation was immediate and visible. My father sat down heavily, his face going gray, while my mother stared at the bank documents, as if they were written in a foreign language. She left you more money? Victoria whispered. She left me everything she could because she knew this would happen, I said, gesturing to the documents covering the coffee table. She knew that this family would find ways to justify taking from me to give to you. She knew that you would treat me as expendable while convincing yourselves you were being reasonable. Claire, my father tried again, but I cut him off. I've hired attorneys, Dad, and a forensic account. We've traced every dollar of the rental income and documented every fraudulent signature. What you've done isn't just morally wrong, it's criminal. You've committed theft, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. The words hung in the air like a verdict. My mother sank back into her chair, her usual composure finally cracking. Victoria was crying quietly, staring at her hands while tears dropped onto the documents that detailed her family's betrayal of her sister. What do you want from us? My father asked finally, his voice stripped of its usual authority. I want every dollar you've stolen from me returned with interest. I want public acknowledgement of what you've done, and I want you to understand that your treatment of me ends now. I'm not the family failure or the child who should be grateful for scraps. I'm the woman you robbed for 14 years while telling her she wasn't good enough to deserve better. My mother looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger or disappointment, but something that might have been fear. You would really destroy this family over money. You already destroyed this family when you decided I didn't matter as much as Victoria. When you chose to steal from me rather than treat me as an equal member of the family. I'm just making your choices visible. I began gathering my documents, placing them back in the folder with deliberate care. You have 1 week to provide a complete accounting of every dollar taken from my inheritance, and a plan for returning it. If you don't, my attorneys will file criminal charges and civil suits that will make this conversation look like a friendly chat. Claire, wait, Victoria said, standing as I moved toward the door. I didn't know, I swear I didn't know any of this. I looked at my sister, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in years. She wasn't evil or deliberately cruel. She was simply someone who had benefited from a system that favored her without questioning why that favor existed or what it cost others. I know you didn't know, Victoria, but now you do. The question is what you're going to do with that knowledge. I left my childhood home for what I suspected might be the last time, walking out into the gray afternoon with a sense of completion I'd never experienced before. Behind me I could hear raised voices as my family began to process the magnitude of what had just been revealed. But their reactions were no longer my responsibility. I had told the truth, demanded justice, and refused to accept their version of family loyalty that required my silence about my own mistreatment. Whatever happened next, I would face it as someone who owned valuable property, had substantial financial resources, and most importantly understood her own worth. The drive back to my apartment felt like emerging from a cave into sunlight. I had finally said everything I'd needed to say, had finally stood up for myself in a way that couldn't be dismissed or minimized. My family would now have to choose whether to acknowledge their wrongs and work toward repair, or whether to double down on their justifications and face the legal consequences of their choices. Either way, I was no longer the woman who slept in basements and accepted whatever accommodation others deemed appropriate for her. I was Claire Thompson, granddaughter of Eleanor Thompson, owner of Pine Lake Retreat, and heir to both property and love that had been waiting for me to claim them. I was finally completely and permanently done making myself small for other people's comfort. 3 days after the confrontation, I received a phone call that would change everything. I was sitting in my apartment, reviewing potential real estate investments with money I was finally free to use, when my phone rang with my father's number. I almost didn't answer, but something told me this conversation would be different from any we'd had before. Claire, My father's voice was barely recognizable, stripped of its usual confidence and authority. "We need to talk, all of us. Can you come to the house tonight?" I said everything I needed to say on Sunday. "Dad, if you want to communicate with me, you can do it through my attorney." "Please," he said, and the word came out cracked and desperate. "Victoria has something she wants to tell you. We all do. This isn't about defending ourselves anymore." I agreed to meet them, though I brought David Park with me this time. I wasn't naive enough to believe that one confrontation would fundamentally change people who had spent 14 years justifying theft. But I was curious about what Victoria wanted to say. The house felt different when I walked in with David beside me. My parents looked older, somehow diminished, as if the weight of their exposed deceptions had physically aged them. Victoria sat on the couch with red-rimmed eyes and a stack of papers in her lap. "Claire," Victoria said before anyone else could speak, "I've spent the last 3 days going through every financial record I could find, every tuition payment, every family vacation, every expense that might have been paid for with money that belonged to you." She held up the papers with shaking hands. "I calculated what my education cost, including private school and university. It comes to approximately $230,000. She pulled out a check and placed it on the coffee table. "This is my entire savings account, plus money I borrowed against my trust fund. It's not enough to cover everything, but it's what I can give you right now. The rest I'll pay back over time with interest." I stared at the check, made out to me for $110,000, and felt something shift inside my chest. This wasn't what I'd expected. "Victoria, you don't need to." "Yes, I do," she interrupted, tears starting to fall again. "I need to because I benefited from theft. I need to because while I was studying abroad and attending graduate school and building my career, you were working 2 jobs and living in a studio apartment, and saving for months to buy a used car. I need to because I've been complicit in this family's treatment of you, even if I didn't know the full extent of it." My father cleared his throat and placed his own documents on the table. "I've liquidated several investments and taken out a loan against the house. This represents the full rental income from Pine Lake Retreat for the past 14 years, plus compound interest calculated at the rate our financial advisor recommended." His check was for $47,000. I felt David's surprise beside me. We'd expected denial, legal maneuvering, maybe partial restitution after lengthy negotiations. We hadn't expected immediate and complete financial accountability. "Why?" I asked. "Why are you doing this now?" My mother spoke for the first time since I'd arrived. "Because Victoria made us understand what we'd really done." Her voice was quiet, almost inaudible. "She spent 2 days researching what you've accomplished despite our limitations. Your work evaluations, your community college honors, the way your patients and coworkers speak about you. She made us see that we didn't limit your opportunities because you weren't capable. We limited them because we were afraid you were too capable." Victoria nodded, wiping her eyes. "I looked up your boss at the dental office. She told me you're the most skilled hygienist they've ever employed. That patients specifically request you because you're so good at what you do. She said you've been covering for other people's mistakes for years and never complained or asked for credit. I also called your community college," my father added reluctantly. "You graduated with a 3.9 GPA while working part-time. Your advisor said you were one of the most dedicated students she'd encountered, that you could have succeeded anywhere if you'd had the financial support." The compliments felt strange coming from them. Validation I'd stopped hoping to receive years ago. But there was something else in their acknowledgments, something that felt like mourning. "We convinced ourselves that we were being practical," my mother continued, "that we were making the best use of limited resources. But the truth is, we were threatened by your independence. You never demanded attention or threw tantrums when you didn't get your way. You just quietly figured out how to succeed without us. That made it easy to justify taking from you," my father said, his voice thick with something that might have been shame. "Because you seemed so self-sufficient, we told ourselves you didn't need our help the way Victoria did." I looked at my family, really looked at them for the first time in years. My parents seemed smaller, older, worn down by the weight of maintaining justifications that had finally crumbled under scrutiny. Victoria looked genuinely stricken, horrified by her unwitting participation in my marginalization. But I also saw something else. The careful positioning that had always characterized our family dynamic. They were sorry they'd been caught, sorry they'd been forced to confront the reality of their choices. I wasn't convinced they were sorry for the choices themselves. What happens now? Victoria asked. How do we move forward from this? It was the question I'd been asking myself since driving away from this house 3 days earlier. Money could be returned, legal obligations could be satisfied, but 14 years of emotional damage couldn't be undone with checks and apologies. I don't know, I said honestly. I appreciate that you're returning the money, and I appreciate Victoria's willingness to acknowledge what happened. But this isn't just about financial theft. This is about a lifetime of being treated as less important, less valuable, less deserving of consideration and love. We know we can't undo the past, my father said carefully, but we're hoping we can build something different going forward. I thought about that possibility as I drove back to my apartment with David, who had remained professionally silent throughout the family meeting. Could people who had spent years systematically diminishing me suddenly change their fundamental approach to our relationship? Did I even want them to try? What's your gut feeling about their sincerity? David asked as we sat in his car outside my building. I think they're genuinely shocked by what Victoria showed them about my capabilities, I said. I think they're scared of the legal consequence. And I think they're grieving the loss of their narrative about family harmony and appropriate resource allocation. But do you think they're sorry for hurting you? Well, I considered the question carefully. I think they're sorry that their system stopped working. I'm not sure they're sorry for creating the system in the first place. Over the following weeks, I made several life-changing decisions. I used part of my returned inheritance to buy a small house in a neighborhood I'd always admired, but never thought I could afford. It had a garden where I could grow vegetables and flowers, a home office where I could pursue interests I'd never had time for, and most importantly, it was mine in a way nothing had ever been before. I also decided to leave Connecticut entirely. With my financial independence secure, I could live anywhere I chose, and I chose the mountains of New Hampshire, 30 minutes from Pine Lake Retreat. I found a position with a dental practice that specialized in serving rural communities, work that felt more meaningful than anything I'd done before. But the most significant change was in how I approached relationships with my family. I established clear boundaries that I communicated in writing and enforced consistently. I would attend major family events if I chose to, but I would stay in hotels rather than family homes. I would maintain polite contact, but I would not pretend that returning money had erased years of emotional damage. Victoria tried the hardest to repair our relationship. She drove to New Hampshire twice in the first month after our confrontation, bringing carefully chosen gifts and memories of our childhood that she hoped might rebuild the sister bond that had been damaged by years of unequal treatment. I keep thinking about things differently now, she told me during one visit, as we sat on the dock at Pine Lake, watching the sun set over the mountains. Like that time when I was 16 and complained that you got to stay home instead of coming on our family vacation to Europe. Mom told me you didn't want to go, that you preferred staying with Uncle Mark. I wanted to go, I said quietly, but there was only enough money in the budget for one plane ticket, and they decided you would benefit more from the cultural experience. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. How many times did that happen? How many times were you told you had choices when you actually didn't have any? It was a good question, one that I'd been asking myself as I worked through years of revisionist family history. How many opportunities had been framed as my personal preferences rather than limitations imposed by others? How many times had my apparent contentment with less been used as justification for giving me less? I don't think it matters anymore, I said, and realized I meant what matters is that now I do have choices. My grandmother's cabin became my refuge during this transition period. I would drive there on weekends, bringing books and projects and the kind of solitude I'd never been able to afford before. I read her extensive library, learning about her interests in local history, environmental conservation, and feminist literature. I found journals she'd kept during her years at the lake, documenting wildlife patterns, weather changes, and her thoughts about family and legacy. One entry, written just months before her death, particularly resonated with me. I watch my son's family and see the same patterns that destroyed my own parents' relationship with their children. Favoritism disguised as practicality, love rationed according to perceived potential. I cannot fix Robert's mistakes, but perhaps I can give Claire the tools to fix her own life. Reading her words, I understood that my inheritance had never been primarily about money or property. It had been about giving me the independence to define my own worth, to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than gratitude for scraps of attention. 6 months after the confrontation, I received a wedding invitation that would test my new boundary. Victoria was marrying her college boyfriend in what my mother described as an intimate family celebration. The invitation was beautiful, expensive, and notably missing any role for me in the wedding party. I called Victoria to congratulate her and explain that I wouldn't be attending. "Claire, please," she said, and I could hear genuine distress in her voice. "I know things have been difficult, but you're my sister. I can't imagine getting married without you there." "I understand that, Victoria, but I also can't imagine attending a wedding where I'm treated as a guest in my own family, where I sit alone at a table because my presence doesn't fit the family image you want to project." "That's not," she started, then stopped. "Okay, it is that, but I want to change it. What would make you comfortable attending?" It was the first time anyone in my family had asked what would make me comfortable, and the question caught me off guard. I thought about it seriously before answering. "I want you to acknowledge publicly what happened between us. I want the family to understand that our relationship is being rebuilt from a foundation of honesty, not pretending the past didn't happen." Victoria was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "Would you be willing to help me write something? Something I could say during the reception?" I agreed, and we spent several hours on the phone crafting a speech that acknowledged our family's mistakes without casting anyone as a villain. Victoria wanted to express gratitude for my forgiveness without assuming I had fully granted it, and to commit to building a relationship based on equality rather than the old patterns of favoritism. The wedding was small and beautiful, held at a country club in Millbrook with about 50 guests. I wore a dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, something elegant and expensive that represented my new ability to present myself as I chose, rather than as budget constraints dictated. When Victoria stood to speak during the reception, she looked directly at me before beginning. "Most wedding speeches focus on the future, but I want to start by acknowledging the past. My family hasn't always been fair or kind to everyone in it. We've made mistakes that hurt people we love, particularly my sister Claire, who deserved much better from us than what she received." The room had gone very quiet. I could see my parents at their table, looking uncomfortable but not objecting. "Claire has shown me what real strength looks like," Victoria continued. "Not the kind that demands attention or recognition, but the kind that persists quietly through difficulties and emerges with integrity and tact. I'm grateful that she's here today, and I'm committed to being the sister she deserves going forward." It wasn't a complete resolution of our family's dysfunction, but it was acknowledgement, which was more than I'd ever received before. After the speech, several relatives approached me with apologies of their own, admitting they'd noticed the unequal treatment, but hadn't felt comfortable addressing it. Uncle Mark was particularly emotional. "I should have said something years ago," he told me as we stood together watching the newlyweds dance. "I should have fought for you the way your grandmother would have wanted me to. You told me the truth when I needed to hear it," I replied. "That's what mattered." As the evening wound down, my mother approached me cautiously. We hadn't spoken much since the confrontation, and our interactions had been polite but distant. "Claire, I wanted to say thank you for coming tonight. I know it wasn't easy for you." "It wasn't," I agree. "But Victoria asked me to be here, and she's been trying to repair our relationship. I wanted to support that effort." My mother nodded, looking older and more fragile than I remembered. "I've been thinking a lot about your grandmother lately, about what she would say if she could see our family now." "What do you think she would say?" "I think she would say that we failed you in exactly the ways she feared we would. And I think she would be proud of how you've handled that failure." It was the closest thing to a genuine apology I'd received from my mother, and I accepted it as such. We weren't going to become close, too much damage had been done for that, but we could perhaps achieve a respectful coexistence. The real transformation in my life came not from my family's belated recognition of their mistakes, but from my own growing confidence in my worth and capabilities. With financial security established, I began pursuing interests I'd never had time or resources for before. I took art classes, learned to sail, and started volunteering with a literacy program for adults who were working to complete their education. I also began dating for the first time since college, freed from the anxiety about money and status that had previously made me feel inadequate as a partner. I met Thomas Chen at a community environmental cleanup event near the lake. He was a park ranger with the State Forestry Service, someone who shared my love of the outdoors and my commitment to work that mattered more than it paid. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally, built on shared interests and mutual respect rather than convenience or desperation. Thomas knew about my family situation. I'd learned the importance of honesty in relationships, but he was more interested in who I was becoming than who I'd been forced to be. "You know what I find most attractive about you?" he told me one evening as we sat on my dock watching stars reflect in the lake. "You're completely yourself. No performance. No trying to be what you think someone else wants. Just Claire, exactly as she is." It was the kind of acceptance I'd spent my life seeking from family members who were incapable of providing it. Finding it with someone who chose to love me rather than someone obligated to do so felt like a different kind of inheritance, the gift of being valued for exactly who I was. 1 year after the Easter confrontation that had changed everything, I hosted my first family gathering at Pine Lake Retreat. It was Victoria's idea, a way to create new memories in a place that had been stolen from me for so long. I was hesitant at first, worried that bringing my family to my sanctuary would contaminate the peace I'd found there. But I realized that reclaiming the cabin meant using it for my own purposes, including the possibility of rebuilding family relationships on my terms rather than theirs. The gathering was small, just Uncle Mark, Victoria, and her husband, and surprisingly my parents, who had driven up from Connecticut with obvious nervousness about how they'd be received. I'd hired a catering service and arranged for everyone to stay in local hotels, maintaining the boundaries that protected my emotional well-being while still allowing for connection. "This place is incredible," Victoria's husband said as I gave them a tour of the property. "I can see why your grandmother loved it so much. She wanted Claire to have a place where she belonged completely," Uncle Mark added, and I noticed that my parents didn't object to his characterization. We spent the afternoon swimming and kayaking, and I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't expected. These were still the people who had hurt me, but they were also people who were trying, however imperfectly, to do better. That evening, as we sat around a fire pit watching the sun set over the lake, my father spoke up unexpectedly. "Claire, I want to say something, and I don't want you to feel like you have to respond or that it changes anything between us. But I need you to know that I understand now what we took from you. Not just the money, but the confidence that you were worth investing in. The security that comes from knowing your family believes in your potential." He paused, staring into the fire. "I failed as a father. I let my own fears and insecurities shape how I treated my children, and I damaged something that can't be fully repaired. But I want you to know that I see who you are now, and I'm proud of what you've built for yourself." It was more acknowledgement than I'd ever expected to receive, and I felt tears threatening despite my resolve to stay emotionally protected. "Thank you for saying that, Dad. It means more than you know. I also want to say," my mother added quietly, "that your grandmother would be so proud of what you've done with her gift. Not just the financial independence, but the way you've used it to create something meaningful and beautiful." I looked around the fire at these people who had shaped my life in ways both harmful and helpful, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the possibility of genuine family connection. Not the performance of family that had characterized my childhood, but real relationships built on honesty and mutual respect. "I want to share something with all of you," I said, pulling out a letter I'd written earlier that day. "I've been thinking about Grandma Eleanor's legacy and what she would want this place to represent going forward." I explained my decision to establish a foundation that would provide scholarships and financial support to young women from families where they were overlooked or undervalued. The Pine Lake Foundation would be funded by a portion of my inheritance, and would offer both financial assistance and mentorship to help recipients build confidence and independence. "I want this place to be a refuge for women who need to discover their own worth," I said, "the way it was for me." Victoria wiped away tears as I finished explaining the foundation's mission. "Can I help with the mentorship program, or fundraising, or anything you need?" "I'd like that," I said, and men. My sister and I would never have the uncomplicated relationship that might have existed if our family had treated us equally, but we could build something real and valuable from the foundation of honesty we'd finally established. As the evening wound down and my family prepared to return to their hotels, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication. I had transformed the pain of my grandmother's stolen legacy into something that could help other women avoid similar damage. I had taken the worst thing my family had done to me and turned it into the best thing I could do for others. Standing alone on the dock after everyone had left, listening to the gentle lap of water against the shore and watching stars emerge in the darkening sky, I felt the profound peace that comes from being exactly where you belong. This place was mine in every sense that mattered, legally, emotionally, spiritually. My grandmother's gift had given me, not just property and money, but the recognition of my own worth that I'd needed to build a life that reflected my values rather than other people's limitations. I thought about the woman who had slept in a basement on Easter Sunday, accepting that accommodation as natural and appropriate. She felt like a different person now, someone I could remember with compassion but no longer had to. That woman had believed she deserved less because she'd been told she was worth less. This woman knew her own value and refused to accept anything that didn't honor it. Tomorrow I would continue building the foundation, working with lawyers and financial advisors to ensure it could help as many women as possible. I would tend to my relationship with Thomas, which continued to grow stronger as we both learned what it meant to love someone who knew their own worth. I would maintain appropriate boundaries with my family while allowing for the possibility of continued healing. But tonight I would simply exist in this place that was mine, surrounded by the peace my grandmother had wanted me to have, grateful for the strength to claim not just an inheritance, but an entire identity that had been waiting for me to discover it. The lake remembered kindness, my grandmother had written, and as I sat in the growing darkness listening to its quiet whispers, I understood that it also remembered justice. It remembered the patient work of women who planted trees they might never sit under, who saved money for granddaughters they might not live to see succeed, who wrote letters that would only be read after their voices had been silent. And now it would remember the foundation built on love and recognition, the scholarships awarded to daughters who deserved better, the mentorship provided to young women learning to value themselves. It would remember that sometimes the most profound legacies emerge, not from what we're given but from what we refuse to let others take away. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.